Endwalker has some of the most incredible dungeons in all of Final Fantasy XIV, but which are the best? In this video, I'll be counting down my top 5 dungeons as of patch 6.1 in Endwalker. For this list, I'll be considering everything that goes into a Final Fantasy XIV dungeon, including the boss fights, the music, the setting, the story, the art design, and generally how fun it is. Number 5. The Stigma Dreamscape. This spot was definitely the most difficult to decide on, because honestly, all of the Endwalker dungeons are great. But despite how many times I thought about putting another dungeon in this spot, I kept hearing that bumping theme from Soken and the Primals in my head, and thinking about how much fun I have running this dungeon each time it shows up on the Expert Roulette. This dungeon is a wild trip into the memory banks of Stigma 4, a militaristic matrix that now threatens to annihilate all of Aetheris. With a little help from the appropriately named Jamming Way, which is totally Soken's Loporrit self-insert, and Omicron N7000, you venture into the battles between an alien race of dragons and a sentient race of robotic AI soldiers hell-bent on destroying everything in their way. It's a setting that is so uniquely Final Fantasy XIV that you'd be hard-pressed to see something like it in any other game. And if you love the Omega Raid series, then this dungeon is sure to spark joy. Number 4. Smileton. When Building Way was talking about the lodging area not being quite ready yet during the MSQ, my first thought was, awesome, housing on the moon. Little did I know that it would involve one of the coolest dungeons in all of Final Fantasy XIV. This is the dungeon that puts the biggest smile on my face every time I run it. Double pun intended. Every time it shows up on the Expert Roulette, I can't help but turn into Grinning Way. Maybe this is my love of the Loporrit showing, but I love everything about this dungeon. The trippy Inception-inspired setting, the absolute banger of a dungeon theme, the absolutely bonkers bosses including a giant face, a wireframe robot, and a giant constructor bot called the Big Cheese. Here's to hoping, now that we've cleaned up this mess in Smileton, that after the crafting-based tribal quest most likely coming later this expansion, a lucky few Warriors of Light will get to live on the moon. Number 3. Ktisis Hyperboreia. The dungeon I have run the most out of any on this list takes the 3rd spot. There's so many reasons I love this dungeon. First off, the sense of urgency that is created in this dungeon is second to none, with Hermes begging you to just give him enough time to hear Meteion's report is so emotionally conflicting, because despite you knowing that you have to stop him, there's a part of you that actually wants to hear that report too. After seeing Hermes' sadness during the MSQ after having to put down yet another of his creations, it's ironic that we have to slay a number of his creations on our way to stopping Hermes. If you really think about it, this adds another layer of sadness to an already very melancholy moment in Final Fantasy XIV. In addition, the bosses in this dungeon are super fun, with a variety of unique mechanics like having to trace footprints in snow and identifying which part of a 3-slice pie to stand in, with final boss Hermes being one of my absolute favorite in all of Final Fantasy XIV. And even though the glamour coming from this dungeon is a recolored set of gear from Shadowbringers, if you're a fan of that Ascian aesthetic as much as I am, I bet you've already run this dungeon a number of times too. Oh, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that you get to run this dungeon in a trust with Emmet, Hith, and Vana. That alone was a memory that I'll never forget. And if I ever find myself missing a certain sassy boy pre-megalomaniacal madman phase, I know I can always visit him here. Number 2. The Aitiascope. This dungeon is the ultimate love letter to the story and characters from A Realm Reborn to Endwalker. Combating against the warped forms of felled enemies that still have an axe to grind with the Warrior of Light and Scions is such a treat. All 3 of the bosses in this dungeon are absolute bangers, seeing the return of Livia, Ritatan, and Aemon, with remixes of their original mechanics. The theme brings you back to that triumphant feeling of the A Realm Reborn days, and echoes back to some of Final Fantasy's most iconic tracks, and reminds you of the very first time you heard the words, hear, feel, think, as you journey to meet Hydaelyn in the flesh. The beauty of the environment of the Ethereal Sea is a sight to behold each and every time. If you had asked me years ago, when we finally journeyed to see Hydaelyn, what would it look like? This is exactly what would have popped into my mind, and seeing it come to fruition is an absolute joy. But perhaps the most special part of this dungeon is that the fallen allies of your past make a reappearance to help you along the way. Even though we didn't get to see the forms of Papalimo, Horsefant, and Moonbrita, receiving the aid of their spirits and feeling their presence was more than enough, with Minfilia being the perfect person to see you to the final boss. But just when you thought the return of your fallen comrades was over, Isael as Shiva gives you a final bit of aid against Amon in one of the most satisfying moments in a boss fight ever. As you can tell, I love this dungeon, but there is one that I love even more. Number 1. The Dead Ends. When I decided to make this list, there was no question as to which dungeon would take the top spot. The Dead Ends is in my mind a near perfect dungeon. Mechanically, each of the bosses are super fun, with gusts of wind pushing puddles of plague across the arena, a giant mechanical death robot, and the kindest of beasts, only here to end the suffering of those who have never known pain. The music in this dungeon has that right combination of hope and sadness, because though you got all of your friends back thanks to a little help from your space mom, your best frenemy, and the bestest bro of all time, you know that you are delving into the depths of despair. The journey that Meteion takes you on experiencing the end of 3 different worlds she visited is harrowing, to say the least. Whenever I run this dungeon, I can't help but think of our world, with the first world representing the fear our world has experienced over the past 2 years, the second being an eerie reflection of just how close to the brink of annihilation we could be at any moment, and the final being a reminder of how a world without pain and perseverance could be even worse than one with it. The last world always gets me, and reminds me of that line in Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, when Kirk says,
"You know that pain and guilt can't be taken away with the wave of a magic wand. They're the things we carry with us, the things that make us who we are. If we lose them, we lose ourselves. I don't want my pain taken away, I need my pain!"
Needless to say, every time I run this dungeon, I think about and feel so much. And in the end, isn't that the perfect encapsulation of the whole of Final Fantasy XIV? Something that tugs at your heartstrings, something that challenges you philosophically, makes you view things in a totally different way, and something that might even help you grow as a person. All the while having a blast playing a video game. Honestly, this dungeon is a perfect encapsulation of the reason I fell in love with the entire Final Fantasy series all the way back in 1997, when Final Fantasy VII made me realize that games could be so much more than a plumber jumping on a dragon turtle's head to rescue a princess. And that's why The Dead Ends takes my number 1 spot. Now, I probably shouldn't have picked such a difficult topic for my first top 5, because honestly, I love the Tower of Zot, the Tower of Babil, Vanaspati, and Alzadaal's Legacy too. But hey, I'm sure that there's aspects of those dungeons that will have their time to shine in future top 5s. So, do you agree with my list? Or would you prefer that Kairos wipe my mind? Let me know your top 5 down in the comments below, and for future Final Fantasy XIV videos, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with a friend. It really would mean the world to me. Lolly ho, and peace out, everyone.